Attorney General debate. Our candidates are Delegate Jason Miyares from Virginia Beach and Attorney General Mark Herring from Loudoun County. The candidates have agreed on the rules for this debate, which will be as follows. Each candidate will give a 3-minute introductory statement. The candidate to go first will be Attorney General Herring. That was decided by a coin toss. After the completion of those 3-minute introductory statements, we will begin with the questions. Questions will be posed to both candidates. The order of response will alternate between the candidates. Each candidate should have a maximum of 2 minutes to answer each question, and the candidate who gives the initial answer will be given 1 minute to reply. At the completion of the Q&A, the candidates will each have a 2-minute closing statement. The parties have agreed that neither candidate will have any props of any kind. They will not have anything in front of them or with them during the debate except a glass of water, 2 pencils, and a blank notepad to make notes. I will be the only one posing questions. There will not be a Q&A or chat function operating for those people watching the debate. Now I welcome to the debate Attorney General Mark Herring and Delegate Jason Miyares. Welcome, gentlemen. Attorney General Herring, your opening statement, please.
I believe the Attorney General should be the people's lawyer, working to keep Virginians safe and ensuring justice, equality, and opportunity for all. That's why for the last 8 years, I have taken on and won big fights that have made our communities safer and expanded our rights. I won a landmark case for marriage equality, blocked Trump's Muslim ban, and protected voting rights. We went to the Supreme Court to protect health care and pre-existing conditions. We won new gun safety laws to protect Virginians from gun violence and took on the gun lobby and won when they sued to block them in court. We've eliminated the backlog of untested rape kits in Virginia, protected a woman's right to choose, and created new tools to protect victims of sexual violence and domestic violence and other crimes. In this race, there is a clear and stark contrast that voters will have between my proven record of protecting Virginians and expanding rights and conservative activist Jason Miyares, who would abuse the powers of the office to roll back all of those gains and make Virginians less safe. Jason Miyares voted against every gun violence prevention measure we passed, including expanded background checks, and he loves to tout his A rating from the NRA. If Jason Miyares is Attorney General, he would side with the gun lobby against the victims of gun violence. Jason Miyares voted against Medicaid expansion, which has brought health care to 500,000 Virginians and is opposed to the Affordable Care Act with its protections for pre-existing conditions. Jason Miyares voted against marijuana legalization and even the simplest common sense criminal justice reform measures that would make our criminal justice system fairer and our communities safer. Jason Miyares is shockingly opposed to LGBTQ rights. Even in 2021, he voted against marriage equality, against discrimination protections, and against adding LGBTQ Virginians to hate crime protections. The bottom line is this: Jason Miyares is wildly out of step on the issues that matter most to Virginians: our safety, our health care, and our right to be treated equally. We have made so much progress over the last 8 years, making Virginia safer and more equal and welcoming for everyone. We cannot afford to turn back that progress now.
Thank you, Attorney General Herring. Delegate Miyares.
I'd like to thank the Virginia State Bar for having me. I'm Jason Miyares. I represent Virginia Beach in the General Assembly. I'm also a former prosecutor, which I think is so important when you're running to be Virginia's top cop. But for you to understand where I want to go as Attorney General, you have to understand where I came from. And I'd like to say that my story doesn't begin in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It actually begins in Havana, Cuba, when a scared 19-year-old girl got on an airplane, penniless and homeless, and not knowing where her next meal was going to come from. That was my mother, Mira Miyares. And so if your family came to this country looking for hope and opportunity, there's a good chance your family is a lot like my family. It'd be the greatest honor of my life to be your Attorney General. My mother fled a country with no consent of the governed in the fall of 1965. And almost 50 years to the day that she left, she was able to walk into a voting booth, get a ballot, and vote for her son, me, to represent her in the oldest democracy in the Western Hemisphere, the Virginia House of Delegates. Now that's what I call the American miracle. And part of what makes the American miracle happen is when people like my mother come here, they're not looking over their shoulder in fear. This is what I hear every day from Republicans, from independents, and from Democrats. They turn on the news, they see the crime reports, and they see and hear fear. Now, I can tell you, as a former prosecutor, I've met with a lot of victims of violent crime. And they always want two things. One, they want justice. And two, they're desperate not to be forgotten. Unfortunately, Mark Herring has forgotten our victims. Why? Because he's been pushing a criminal first, victim last mindset that's made Virginians less safe and less secure. The Attorney General is the top cop for Virginia. And by every objective standard, Mark Herring has failed at his job. Mark has certainly bragged about turning the Attorney General's office into, quote, a liberal powerhouse. But what has this liberal powerhouse actually done as Virginia's top cop? Violent crime is at the highest rate it's been in 2 decades. Virginia's murder rate is the highest it's been since the turn of the century. We desperately need some type of check and balance in Richmond. We've seen a far left liberal monopoly push an anti-police agenda that's made Virginians less safe, less secure, while letting out murderers, rapists, and cop killers out early, back on the street, and Mark Herring allowed that to happen. Listen, there's 2 people on this stage today. I've been a prosecutor, Mark Herring hasn't. I've actually been in the courtroom and prosecuted violent criminals. Mark Herring never has. I've held the hands of the family members who suffered the anguish and utter humiliation of seeing their loved ones, killers and rapists, set free. Mark Herring's never even bothered to call them. Why? Because he's been more interested in advocating a far left political agenda than actually keeping Virginians safe. I'm going to have one focus as your Attorney General, going to enforce the law without fear or favor. You see, Mark Herring sees everything through the lens of politics. That's because he's been trained as a politician. I'm different. I've been trained as a prosecutor. Mark Herring's failed at his job to keep Virginians safe. Now it's time for Mark Herring to lose his job.
Our first question is in the area of healthcare coverage. In 2019, Virginia's expansion of Medicaid was implemented. This was a part of the broader Affordable Care Act of 2010. Do you support the ACA? If so, what is your position on restoring the individual mandate? Attorney General Herring.
I absolutely support the Affordable Care Act and have for many years. Now, I was raised by a single mom, and our family had its share of ups and downs, and there were times when she could not afford health insurance. And I remember how anxious she felt about that. And I've talked to Virginians who felt that same way, who are worried about what happens if pre-existing conditions, protections for pre-existing conditions go away, that they won't be able to afford health care that they or their family need. That's why I have gone to court over and over to defend the Affordable Care Act, to protect it from legal challenges, because it means so much to so many Virginians. Over 500,000 Virginians were able to get access to health care because of Medicaid expansion. But you know what? Jason Miyares voted against Medicaid expansion. And I've continued to fight to protect Virginians against having those pre-existing conditions, the protections for pre-existing conditions to go away. But Jason Miyares, over and over, has opposed the Affordable Care Act, has opposed that even though it has important protections for pre-existing conditions. I've talked to women who are breast cancer survivors who are just really worried that if this lawsuit is successful, that we have gone to the Supreme Court to defend, If that's successful, those protections go away. And if that's successful, all of those Virginians who were able to get health insurance through Medicaid expansion will go away. Prescription drug costs will be higher for seniors. So many people get their health care now on the exchange that would go away. This is too important to let go. And it is a major difference between me and Jason Miyares, who is opposed to the Affordable Care Act, who would work to take away your health care and allow those pre-existing conditions, protections for pre-existing conditions to go away. This is a really important issue for all Virginians, and I will always work to fight to protect your health care.
Delegate Miyares.
This shows a little bit of the different philosophy between myself and Mark Herring. I believe in calling balls and strikes. I certainly don't also believe in superseding my judgment of the judgment of the General Assembly and the governor, which Mark Herring has done repeatedly. In fact, the Daily Press has said that he treats the law like an a la carte menu, deciding which law to enforce and which law not to enforce. The bottom line is the General Assembly draft the laws, the governor signs the law. My job is to call balls and strikes and to defend the law. And so if that's the judgment of the General Assembly, that's where they are. Now, I'm in the General Assembly. I oftentimes like to say I don't vote on ideas, I vote on bills. And back in 2019, I was the proud author of the legislation that was called the Medicaid work requirement legislation. It was broadly supported by Democrats. At least a dozen Democrats in the General Assembly supported that. And it simply said, listen, if you're an able-bodied adult and you're on Medicaid, you're going to have to show that you're actually seeking some type of work, because here's what's happened with Medicaid in our state budget. It's gone from about 5% of the state budget a couple decades ago to close to 20% of our state budget. So unless you have some type of control over the cost, that means less money for your child's school, less money for cops in your neighborhood, less money for the very programs that also help Virginians every day. And so it's important that we have sensible, smart reforms that we're able to both recognize expansion of Medicaid, but at the same time saying, if you're an able-bodied adult, we're going to have you work for it. That's very, very different than what Mark Herring has done in his office, which he's arbitrarily decided which laws to enforce, which laws to ignore, and that's simply not the role of the Attorney General. So if you're tired of a politician in that office that's simply pushing a far-left agenda that's part of this far-left liberal monopoly, making Virginians less safe and secure, then Mark Herring's your job. If you want somebody who's a former prosecutor that's going to call balls and strikes, then I'm going to be your candidate. I'm also always believed and supported protection for pre-existing conditions as well.
Attorney General Herring.
Well,
1 minute.
Jason wants to deflect your attention from the real issue here. The real issue is your health care. And the lawsuit that Republican attorneys general brought that Donald Trump supported would take your health care away. And Jason Miyares would be right there. He is opposed to the Affordable Care Act. He's always been opposed to the Affordable Care Act. And protections for pre-existing conditions are a part of it. And so the question is, are you worried about your health care being taken away? Are you worried about protections for pre-existing conditions going away? If so, then I should be your attorney general, because I will fight for your health care. Jason Miyares voted against Medicaid expansion. He is opposed to the Affordable Care Act, and he would be right there along with Donald Trump and the other Republican attorneys general trying to take it away from you. We can't let that happen.
Our next question goes to the issue of gun control. On April 16, 2007, Virginia Tech suffered what was at that time the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. 12 years later, on May 31st, 2019, another devastating mass shooting occurred at the municipal building in Virginia Beach. What will you do to protect Virginians from future tragedies? Delegate Miyares.
Listen, I think we all want the same thing. We all want to be able to lower gun violence. The question is, what are the actual policies that actually have a proven track record of lowering gun violence? Now, there's only been one person on this debate stage that's actually prosecuted felons that have used guns in the commission of a felony, and that's me. It's not politician Mark Herring. Now, between the mid-90s, about 1993 and 2016, gun ownership and guns in the circulation in the general population increased by about 100 million. At the same time, gun violence actually went down. So what happened? It was you had a variety of states that instituted truth in sentencing, parole abolition, that got violent criminals off our street, And not surprisingly, violent crime went down. In fact, well north of 80% of violent crimes done by repeat offenders. So if you want somebody who's going to go after gun violence, that'll be me going after the criminals using the guns. Now look at what Mark Herring did. Mark Herring turned down money from the previous administration to actually prosecute gun violence as part of the successor of Project Exile, because he did not want to obey the federal rule that said that if you picked up an illegal immigrant here using gun in the commission of a felony, you have to report them to ICE. So Mark Herring refused to prosecute gun violence cases because he was more interested in protecting a far left political agenda as far as this far left liberal monopoly that we have in Richmond. That's the difference. I will prosecute gun violence cases while Mark Herring has refused to do so. It's one more example of why Mark Herring has failed at his job to be Virginia's top cop. So if you want a politician who's been a politician for 20 years to continue push this far left liberal monopoly agenda that's making Virginians less safe and less secure, Mark Herring is your guy. If you want a prosecutor that's going to call balls and strikes and actually prosecute gun violence, I'm your candidate.
We have a gun violence problem in this country, and the status quo is not acceptable. We are raising a generation of young people who are going to school practicing active shooting drills. They're going to the park thinking they may be the next innocent bystander to get killed by gun violence. When you're the Attorney General, when you're called upon sometimes to console loved ones, people who have lost loved ones to gun violence. And it is so important for them to know that you're doing everything you can to stop gun violence. That's why I've taken on the gun lobby. That's why I've worked to get expanded background checks passed. That's why we worked to get a red flag law passed. That's why we are doing this in order to make our communities safer. But Jason Miyares voted against every one of those gun safety measures. If it were up to him, there'd be more guns out there. He even opposed expanded background checks. 87% of homicides are committed by people with guns. 50% of robberies are committed by people with guns. And Jason Miyares would put more guns out on the street so that they would be armed even more. So if you want to talk about stopping violence, we've got to focus on the gun violence problem that we have. And that means taking on the gun lobby. He'll be right there with the gun lobby to say, we need less regulation, not more. These are laws that are common sense, that are supported by a large percentage of Virginians, that will actually do things like make our communities safer. And Jason Miyares voted against every single one of them because he will side with the gun lobby instead of the victims of gun violence.
If you want an attorney general that's not going to turn down federal grant money to prosecute violent criminals using guns in the commission of a felony, I'm your candidate. If you want somebody who won't because of a political agenda, Mark Herring's your candidate. By the way, let's talk about gun violence. Mark Herring is also part of this parole board. He signed off on them letting out David Simpkins. David Simpkins had 56 prior felonies, 14 prior armed robberies, including he got picked up on a child abduction charge and a forcible sodomy charge. He got out 56 prior felonies, and what did he do when he got out on his 57th chance? He got armed, he got a pistol, he walked into a convenience store and held the gun at the head of a clerk. The reason why he's back on the street today is Mark Herring is the parole board's lawyer, and he allowed David Simpkins to commit his 57th felony just this year. As the prosecutor said in that case, David Simpkins should have never been allowed back on the street to harm our community. Mark Herring allowed that to happen. He deserves to lose his job.
Our next question goes to the issue of voting rights. With voting restrictions being enacted in several states, how do you envision the AG's office protecting the rights of Virginia citizens to vote? This question goes to Attorney General Herring.
Thank you. And first, let me just say what Jason said about me was just totally not true, and he knows that. But about voting rights are foundational to our democracy. The freedom to vote is foundational. And as Attorney General, I have fought to protect voting rights. And we had a lot of challenges last year because of the pandemic, and especially because Donald Trump and his supporters were trying to undermine the integrity of the elections. But because of my efforts and my team's efforts, we were able to make sure that in Virginia we had free, fair, safe, and accurate elections. And Jason Miyares buys into all of that voter suppression stuff. He voted against removing barriers to exercising the freedom to vote time and again. He voted against the Virginia Voting Rights Act. And, you know, the Attorney General is responsible for enforcing that. And he wants to be Attorney General. Why? Because he is opposed to protecting people's voting rights in this way. And he wants to dismantle the protections that we've put. You know, he's right alongside of Donald Trump and the Republican attorneys general who would have, had he been Attorney General, he would have been right there with him, filing a lawsuit to try to overturn the election to help perpetuate the big lie. And the job of Attorney General is too important to be put in the hands of a loyal foot soldier to Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. We need to have an Attorney General who believes in protecting the freedom to vote, to removing barriers to the freedom to vote. And that's what I've done as Attorney General, and that's what I will continue to do.
Delegate Miyares?
Here's the standard we should apply for as public servants. Should be hard to cheat, but easy to vote. That's the standard I've always tried to apply as a member of the General Assembly. Listen, election integrity is not a partisan issue. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. It's an American issue. You can see it in the polling. After the 2016 election, the majority of Democrats had real questions about the integrity of the election. And obviously there's a lot of Republicans that this year. So the idea is we have to restore integrity back into our election system. And one of the key ways to do that is voter ID. That's not something logical or controversial. Poll after poll shows the vast majority of Americans, including Democrats, support voter ID laws. If it requires a voter ID for you to get on an airplane, for you to get a library card, heck, Mark Herring requires you to get a voter ID if you get a government-issued vaccine, but you don't require a voter ID to vote? That lacks all common sense. But the one thing we know is common sense is not very common in Richmond these days. And so Mark Herring, rather than defend a voter ID law that was passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor, decided for purely partisan reasons he was not going to defend it. What does that mean for you, the taxpayer? And then he had to hire an outside law firm, pay him $400, $500 an hour to rich lawyers to defend the law that he refused to defend solely because of purely political partisan reasons. What does it mean? It means that's hundreds of thousands of dollars that could have gone to your child's school, that could have gone back to the roads, could have been back to pay for police officers, and Mark Herring refused to do what he was elected to do. In fact, when he ran in 2013, he promised he was going to take the politics out of the office. What has he done instead? He's turned into a, quote, liberal powerhouse. Well, that liberal powerhouse is costing you and your family money by refusing to defend common sense voter ID laws that are ensuring the integrity of our election. Mark Herring has failed at his job. It's time that he loses his job.
Attorney General Herring?
Here's the bottom line. The freedom to vote is foundational to our democracy. And Jason Miyares voted time and again against removing barriers to the freedom to vote. And the Attorney General is charged with enforcing the Virginia Voting Rights Act. And he's opposed to the Virginia Voting Rights Act. He voted against it. And so if protecting your right to vote is important to you, then I'm the Attorney General for you. And Jason Miyares would be right there with other Republican attorneys general and Donald Trump talking about integrity and all this other stuff that is not an issue here in Virginia. We have free, fair, accurate, and safe elections. And Jason Miyares would want to put more roadblocks in your way to keep you from voting and to make it harder for you to vote and exercise your freedom to vote.
The next question, we're going to shift to issues of diversity. As of July 1st, 2020, Virginia prohibits discrimination for employment as to gender identity or sexual orientation. What will you do to enforce this new legislation? Delegate Miyares.
Listen, one of my principal articles of my faith is Imago Dei. Every single person is made in the image of God. Every American should be treated with the utmost of the dignity and respect. You know, gay marriage is the law of the land. I was one of only, I think, 4 or 5 members of my own party that voted to end the statutory ban in Virginia. And my job as Attorney General is I'm not going to supersede the authority or the judgment of the General Assembly or the governor. And so that's very, very different than Mark Herring, who even the Washington Post has noted that when he picks and chooses which laws to enforce and which laws not to enforce, that essentially he's nothing but a political opportunist. And so I think it's critical to important that we have 2 very important interests going on in America today. We have the idea that we need to treat every single Virginian with dignity and respect. We also have to balance the fact that we got to respect people's religious liberty as well. That important balancing act is something we're working through together as a people. But I'm confident of this. I'm going to enforce whatever law the General Assembly and the governor passes. I'm going to be loyal to the authority of the U.S. Constitution, the Virginia Constitution, and the Code of Virginia. That's the key point and key difference between myself and Mark Herring. He's a 20-year politician who's pushed a far-left liberal political agenda as part of this far-left liberal monopoly that we have in Richmond that's making Virginians less safe and less secure. So if you want somebody who's a former prosecutor, somebody who's simply going to call balls and strikes, then I'm going to be your candidate. If you want somebody who's pushing a really far-left liberal agenda, who's going to side with this far-left liberal agenda with the parole board that's allowing murderers and rapists and killers out early and back on our streets, Mark Hurley's your guy. Mark Herring is your guy. So it's an honor to be your next Attorney General because I'm going to call balls and strikes. I'm going to take the politics out of the Attorney General's office.
Herring.
One of the first things I did as Attorney General was to go into court and say, no, we are not going to defend an unconstitutional ban on marriage for same-sex couples. We're going to fight for marriage equality. And we won. And look at all the progress we made. And so I was right to fight for marriage equality. It put Virginia on the right side of history, and it put us on the right side of the law. And since then, we've made so much progress. We've passed the Virginia Values Act. We've expanded protections for our LGBTQ Virginians. But Jason Miyares has stood in the way of that progress every single step. He voted against, even as recently as 2021, he is shockingly opposed to LGBTQ rights. He voted against marriage equality. He voted against non-discrimination protections. He voted against adding LGBTQ Virginians to hate crime protections. And the Virginia Values Act that includes a lot of those non-discrimination protections is supposed to be enforced by the Attorney General. Jason Miyares voted against all of those. Why does he want to be Attorney General? Because he wants to undo that. He wants to not enforce it, and he wants to dismantle all of those protections and hard-fought gains that we've made in Virginia. Everyone deserves to be treated equally and fairly. And that's what I've been doing as Attorney General, working to make sure that people's rights are protected, that they are treated equally and fairly. That's what I've done. And Jason Miyares has stood in the way every step of the way, and if given the opportunity, would do everything he could to roll that back and dismantle that progress.
Elga Miyares, your response?
You know, Mark talks about the right side of history. You know what's not the right side of history? The Vincent Martin case. Vincent Martin was sentenced to 30 years in prison for multiple armed robbery. He gets out after serving only 6 years. He's out not even a year. He commits another armed robbery. He's going down the wrong way in a one-way street. He's stopped by a young 23-year-old police officer by the name of Michael Connors. Michael Connors is approaching the vehicle. He's shot in the neck. He's struggling on the ground to survive. Vincent Martin gets out of the car and puts 3 bullets in that young officer's head. Vincent Martin was given life without the possibility of parole, which I was growing up in Virginia. That meant you don't get out. Well, guess what? Vincent Martin got released by this parole board. And who was the parole board's lawyer? Mark Herring. His number one job is to keep you and your family safe. By all objective standards, Mark Herring has failed at that job. And therefore, it's time to replace him with somebody new